Zektar stood on the bridge of the starship Harmony's edge and watched the small human shuttle approach their docking bay. His four arms crossed over his crystalline chest plates as he studied the tiny vessel through the viewing port. The shuttle looked fragile compared to the massive coalition warships that filled the hangar, like a child's toy among real weapons. He could not understand why Admiral Krexthul had called this emergency meeting for such insignificant creatures. The war against the Devourers had been going badly for 18 months. Every battle ended the same way, with coalition forces retreating while the insectoid enemies consumed another world. The Devourers moved like a plague across the galaxy, eating everything in their path and growing stronger with each victory. Entire star systems had gone dark under their advance. Now these unknown humans claimed they wanted to help fight. Zektar flexed his secondary arms and felt the familiar weight of his plasma rifle against his back. As a Vorthak warrior, he had fought in over 30 battles against the Devourers. His people were known throughout the coalition as the finest soldiers in the galaxy. Their natural armor could stop most weapons, and their four arms made them deadly in close combat. Yet even the Vorthak had struggled against the endless swarms of Devourers. The shuttle doors opened with a soft hiss, and the human delegation stepped onto the deck. Zektar studied them with growing confusion. They were smaller than he expected, barely reaching his chest in height. Their skin looked soft and pink, without any visible armor or defensive scales. Most strange of all, they only had 2 arms each. How could such weak-looking beings survive in space, let alone fight in a war? The lead human introduced himself as Captain John Murphy. He had gray hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of many years spent in combat. Behind him stood a female called Dr. Lisa Martinez, who seemed excited to meet alien species. She kept looking around at the different coalition members with bright, curious eyes. The other humans in their group wore simple gray uniforms that looked nothing like proper military gear. Admiral Krexthul called the meeting to order in the main conference room. Representatives from 12 different coalition species filled the circular chamber. The massive Gorvek delegates towered over everyone else with their thick, rocky skin and club-like arms. The elegant Zephyrians floated near the ceiling, their translucent bodies glowing with soft bioluminescence. In one corner, the insectoid Mantari clicked their mandibles in what passed for their version of conversation. Captain Murphy approached the central speaking platform and activated the holographic display. Images of Earth appeared in the air, showing a blue and green world that looked surprisingly peaceful. The human began explaining their planet's history and their desire to join the coalition war effort. Zektar listened with growing skepticism as Murphy described human military capabilities. The weapons seemed primitive, using chemical explosions to fire metal projectiles instead of energy beams. Their armor offered minimal protection compared to powered exoskeletons used by most coalition forces. Their ships appeared to rely on simple rocket propulsion rather than advanced gravity drives. Several coalition delegates began murmuring among themselves. General Thexkar of the Bruthari military leaned forward and spoke in his deep rumbling voice. What exactly do you think these soft creatures can contribute to our war effort? They appear to lack even basic defensive capabilities. Captain Murphy remained calm under the obvious dismissal. He clasped his hands behind his back and looked directly at the general. We understand your concerns about our physical limitations. However, we bring something different to this conflict. We have been fighting wars on our planet for over 5,000 years. We have learned many things about combat that might prove useful. Dr. Martinez stepped forward and activated another holographic display. This one showed human military history with images of ancient battles and modern warfare. Humans have developed extensive knowledge of strategy, tactics, and psychological warfare. We excel at adapting to new situations and finding creative solutions to military problems. Admiral Krexthul studied the displays with his large compound eyes. Your species does seem to have considerable experience with conflict. However, the Devourers are unlike any enemy you have faced before. They show no mercy, take no prisoners, and cannot be reasoned with. They exist only to consume and reproduce. Murphy nodded slowly. We have dealt with similar challenges on Earth. Some of our conflicts involved enemies who seemed impossible to defeat through conventional means. We learned to think differently about warfare, to use unconventional methods when standard tactics failed. The room fell silent as the coalition leaders considered this statement. Zektar found himself assigned as the human liaison, a duty he considered beneath his warrior status. As the meeting ended, he approached Captain Murphy with barely concealed irritation. I will be working with your people during the integration process, Zektar said, his translator converting his natural clicking sounds into standard coalition speech. I hope you understand the seriousness of this war. Many good soldiers have died fighting the Devourers. Murphy looked up at the tall alien warrior with steady eyes. We take this very seriously, Commander Zektar. My people know exactly what it means to fight for survival. We have been doing it longer than most species have existed. Something in the human's tone made Zektar pause. There was no boasting or false bravado in Murphy's voice, just a quiet confidence that seemed out of place coming from such a small, fragile creature. For the first time since the humans arrived, Zektar wondered if there might be more to these beings than their appearance suggested. The training facility on Moon Kepler 442c buzzed with activity as coalition forces prepared for joint exercises with their new human allies. Zektar walked through the equipment bays and watched human soldiers examining their gear with careful attention. Their weapons still looked primitive to his experienced eyes, but he noticed how methodically they checked each piece of equipment. Captain Murphy introduced him to the human squad that would be working under his command. Sergeant Alex Turner stood at attention, his lean frame suggesting speed rather than strength. Corporal Katie Williams handled a collection of explosive devices with casual familiarity that made several alien observers step back nervously. Private First Class Danny Rodriguez adjusted his communication equipment while studying coalition radio frequencies. Specialist Emma Johnson organized medical supplies with the efficiency of someone who had treated many battlefield injuries. The first training exercise began poorly for the humans. In direct combat simulations against Gorvek heavy assault troops, they were overwhelmed within minutes. Their chemical projectile weapons barely scratched the thick, rocky hide of their opponents, while the Gorvek's plasma cannons tore through human defensive positions like paper. Zektar watched the human squad get eliminated repeatedly in scenario after scenario. Perhaps we were too optimistic about human capabilities, General Thexkar commented as he observed the exercises from the command center. They seem unable to compete with proper military forces in standard combat situations. Zektar found himself oddly disappointed by the human performance. He had expected more after Captain Murphy's confident words during their first meeting. The humans fought bravely, but they lacked the natural advantages that made other coalition species effective warriors. Their reaction times were slower than Mantari reflexes. Their strength was less than Bruthari power, and their durability could not match Vorthak endurance. However, something strange happened during the third day of exercises. The humans stopped trying to fight like other coalition species and began using different tactics entirely. Instead of meeting their opponents in open combat, they started setting traps and ambushes. They used the environment to their advantage, creating choke points and kill zones that maximized their limited firepower. Sergeant Turner proved particularly creative at finding weaknesses in enemy formations. During one exercise against Zephyrian aerial units, he studied their flight patterns for hours before developing a strategy using weighted nets and timed explosives. The floating aliens found themselves grounded and helpless within minutes of engaging the human position. Corporal Williams showed a disturbing talent for improvised explosives. She could create devastating weapons from common materials found in any coalition facility. Zektar watched her turn cleaning supplies into chemical bombs and wondered where humans learned such dangerous knowledge. When he asked, she simply smiled and said her grandfather had taught her during something called the Troubles on Earth. What truly unsettled Zektar was how quickly the humans adapted to each new challenge. After losing to Mantari speed attacks, they developed tactics using sound and vibration to predict insectoid movements. When Bruthari's strength proved overwhelming, they created pit traps and used leverage to turn enemy power against itself. Each defeat became a learning opportunity rather than just a loss. The humans also displayed unusual endurance compared to other coalition species. While most aliens required 12 hours of rest each day, the humans functioned effectively on 6 to 8 hours of sleep. They could maintain alertness during extended operations that would exhaust other soldiers. During one 48-hour training exercise, Private Rodriguez continued operating communications equipment despite suffering what should have been incapacitating fatigue. Dr. Martinez arrived at the facility during the second week with a team of human researchers. She began studying coalition species with the same intensity that military personnel used to analyze enemy capabilities. Her questions seemed innocent enough at first, focusing on biology and social structures. However, Zektar noticed she paid particular attention to psychological profiles and behavioral patterns. "Your people learn very quickly," she commented, while watching Mantari combat drills. "Each species has developed fascinating adaptations for warfare. The way Mantari coordinate their attacks through pheromone communication is remarkably efficient." Zektar found her interest disturbing rather than flattering. Dr. Martinez studied coalition forces with the same analytical approach that intelligence officers used when planning attacks against enemy positions. She cataloged strengths and weaknesses with scientific precision, creating detailed files on every species in the facility. The breakthrough came during a complex scenario involving multiple enemy types. Coalition doctrine called for specialized units to handle each threat separately, but the humans refused to follow standard procedures. Instead, they created what they called integrated response teams that used psychological warfare to turn different enemy groups against each other. Sergeant Turner demonstrated the technique by broadcasting false communications between simulated devourer units. Using captured pheromone samples and sound analysis, his team created messages that suggested betrayal and resource conflicts within enemy ranks. The result was chaos, as different devourer groups began attacking each other instead of focusing on coalition targets. "How did you know that would work?" Zektar asked after the exercise ended. Turner shrugged as he cleaned his weapon. "Humans have been studying group psychology for centuries. When you understand what motivates different factions, you can usually find ways to create conflict between them. Works on most social species." The casual way Turner described psychological manipulation made Zektar uncomfortable. This was not honorable combat between warriors, but something more sinister. The humans seemed to view warfare as a science, rather than a test of courage and skill. They studied their enemies like specimens in a laboratory, looking for weaknesses to exploit, rather than seeking glorious battle. During the final week of training, an incident occurred that changed Zektar's perception of human capabilities entirely. Private Rodriguez suffered serious injuries during a live fire exercise when a Gorvek plasma round grazed his torso. The injury should have ended his participation immediately, but the human simply applied medical tape to his wounds and continued fighting for 3 more hours. Zektar watched in shock as Rodriguez operated his equipment with broken ribs and internal bleeding. The human's face was pale with pain, but his hands remained steady on the communications gear. Only when the exercise officially ended did he finally collapse and allow Specialist Johnson to treat his injuries properly. "Why did you not report your condition?" Zektar demanded, as medical personnel transported Rodriguez to the facility hospital. Rodriguez looked up from his stretcher with eyes that held no regret. "Mission comes first, sir. The unit needed communications, support. Personal comfort is secondary to operational success. That night, Zekatar sat in his quarters and reviewed the training reports. The humans had consistently scored poorly in direct combat exercises, but their performance in unconventional scenarios was remarkable. They displayed capabilities that went far beyond what their physical limitations should have allowed. More troubling was their apparent comfort with tactics that other coalition species considered dishonorable or extreme. He began to wonder if Captain Murphy had been completely honest about human capabilities during their first meeting. These people clearly understood warfare in ways that went far beyond simple combat skills. They approached conflict with a methodical ruthlessness that made Zekatar question whether inviting them into the coalition had been wise. The transport ship dropped out of hyperspace above planet Zerion Prime, and Zekatar immediately knew something was wrong. The agricultural world should have been covered with the green glow of vast farming installations, but large sections of the surface appeared dark and lifeless. Smoke columns rose from several major settlements, while orbital sensors detected no communication signals from the ground. Devourer presence confirmed, reported Lieutenant Commander Vexhai from the sensor station. Multiple landing sites detected across the southern continent. Estimated enemy strength suggests a scouting force of approximately 12 to 15 individuals. Admiral Krexthul studied the tactical display with growing concern. Intelligence reports indicated this was a minor incursion. If the Devourers have already established breeding sites, we may be looking at hundreds of hostiles within days. The mission briefing called for a simple search and destroy operation. Coalition forces would land, locate the Devourer scouts, eliminate them before they could signal the main hive fleet, then evacuate any surviving civilians. Standard procedure required overwhelming force to ensure quick victory with minimal casualties. Captain Murphy approached the command table where Zekatar was reviewing deployment plans. Request permission to take point with my squad, Commander. We can provide reconnaissance while your forces prepare for the main assault. Zekatar looked up from his tactical display with surprise. Human units are not equipped for independent operations against Devourer forces. Your weapons lack sufficient stopping power, and your armor provides inadequate protection against their claws. Murphy studied the planetary surface data with calm attention. Understood, sir. However, our smaller size and different movement patterns might allow us to gather intelligence without triggering their defensive responses. Devourers are adapted to detect coalition species, but they have no experience with human signatures. Against his better judgment, Zekatar approved the request. The mixed unit that landed on Zerion Prime included his own Vorthak combat team along. With the human squad he had been training with for weeks. They set down in the ruins of Farming Settlement 7, where sensors had detected the highest concentration of Devourer activity. The scene that greeted them was worse than anything shown in the orbital scans. The Devourers had not simply killed the human colonists, but had been using their bodies as food sources for rapid reproduction. Scattered around the settlement were the remains of what had once been a thriving community of 3,000 people. Now only empty buildings and organic residue marked where families had lived and worked. Population estimate was incorrect, Sergeant Turner reported as his team moved through the settlement ruins. Based on biomass calculations, we are looking at reproductive cycles that suggest at least 80 to 100 active hostiles in this area alone. Zekatar felt his stomach drop at the implications. Coalition doctrine called for immediate retreat when facing more than 3-to-1 odds against Devourers. His mixed unit was equipped to handle a dozen enemies, not 100. Requesting immediate extraction and orbital bombardment authorization, he transmitted to the command ship. Captain Murphy appeared at his side before he could complete the transmission. Request delay on evacuation, Commander. My people have a different approach that might work better than orbital strikes. The situation has exceeded mission parameters, Zekatar replied firmly. We cannot engage these numbers with our current force strength. Murphy pointed toward the settlement's industrial district, where thermal sensors showed concentrated Devourer activity. They are using the grain storage facilities as breeding chambers. Orbital bombardment will destroy the infrastructure, but many hostiles will survive in underground tunnels. We can eliminate the threat more efficiently using ground-based tactics. Before Zektar could respond, Corporal Williams was already moving toward the storage buildings with her explosive equipment. Sergeant Turner began deploying his team in positions that made no sense according to Coalition tactical doctrine. Instead of establishing defensive perimeters, the humans were spreading out into individual hunting positions. "What is your squad doing?" Zektar demanded as he watched the humans disappear into the settlement ruins. "Guerrilla warfare," Murphy replied simply. "We are going to make the Devourers come to us on our terms, rather than meeting them in open combat." The human strategy unfolded over the next 6 hours like nothing Zektar had ever witnessed. Instead of engaging Devourer patrols directly, the humans began a systematic campaign of psychological warfare. They used captured Devourer corpses as bait to draw groups into carefully prepared kill zones. They destroyed food sources in patterns designed to create maximum confusion within the hive structure. Specialist Johnson proved particularly effective at what she called surgical elimination. The human medic moved through the settlement like a ghost, locating isolated Devourers and killing them with clinical efficiency. She used her medical knowledge to ensure each target died quickly and quietly without alerting nearby hostiles to the danger. Corporal Williams demonstrated skills that went far beyond normal military training. She rigged entire buildings to collapse. On command, created improvised mines from farming equipment, and turned the settlement's own infrastructure into a network of deadly traps. When Zektar asked where she learned such techniques, she simply said her family had taught her about making things go boom. The most disturbing aspect of human tactics was their apparent understanding of Devourer psychology. Private Rodriguez intercepted and analyzed enemy communications, learning their chemical signaling system with frightening speed. Within hours, he was broadcasting false messages that created panic and confusion within the hive structure. "How are you able to decode their language so quickly?" Zektar asked as he watched Rodriguez manipulate Devourer pheromone transmissions. "Pattern recognition," Rodriguez replied while adjusting his equipment. "Human brains are very good at finding connections between different types of information. Once you understand the basic structure of their communication system, the rest follows logical patterns." The breakthrough came when a wounded Devourer drone attempted to retreat from one of Williams's explosive traps. Coalition forces had never seen enemy survivors because Devourers typically fought to the death rather than showing any self-preservation instincts. However, this drone was clearly trying to escape rather than continue fighting. Sergeant Turner moved to intercept the fleeing creature with methodical precision. Instead of simply killing it, he began what he called information extraction. Using a combination of captured pheromones and physical intimidation, Turner forced the drone to provide detailed intelligence about hive locations and defensive capabilities. Zektar watched in growing horror as the human soldier demonstrated perfect understanding of Devourer fear responses. Turner had learned enough about their psychology to cause genuine terror in a species that Coalition scientists believed was incapable of emotion. The drone began transmitting location data and tactical information with desperate eagerness to avoid further torment. "This creature is providing detailed intelligence about underground breeding chambers," Turner reported as if discussing weather conditions. "Appears they have been here longer than initial estimates suggested. Full colony establishment is nearly complete." The systematic destruction of the Devourer colony took another 12 hours. The humans moved through underground tunnels with the same efficiency they had shown in the surface settlement. They understood instinctively how to disrupt hive operations and create maximum psychological impact with minimum resource expenditure. Dr. Martinez arrived with a field research team during the final phase of operations. She studied Devourer specimens. With the same scientific interest she had shown toward Coalition species during training exercises. Her questions focused on biological vulnerabilities and behavioral patterns that could be exploited in future encounters. Fascinating adaptation. To agricultural environments, she commented while examining a breeding chamber. They have modified their reproductive cycles to take advantage of high-protein food sources. This suggests much greater intelligence than previous reports indicated. As the mission concluded, Zektar realized the humans had not simply defeated the Devourers, but had learned to think like them. They understood enemy motivations and capabilities with disturbing accuracy. More troubling was their apparent comfort with tactics that pushed far beyond normal military engagement into something that resembled scientific torture. The orbital bombardment that should have been necessary never occurred. Instead, a force of less than 20 soldiers had eliminated over 100 Devourers using methods that Zektar was not sure he could properly explain in his mission report. The humans had won through superior understanding of their enemy rather than superior firepower, and that realization made him deeply uncomfortable. The mission on Zirion Prime extended into its third day as deeper scans revealed the true scope of Devourer infiltration. What intelligence had classified as a minor scouting operation was actually a full-scale colonization effort that had been underway for weeks. The underground tunnel network stretched for hundreds of kilometers beneath the planet's surface, connecting multiple breeding sites across 3 continents. Zektar found himself following Captain Murphy and his squad deeper, into territory that should have been impossible for such a small force to penetrate. The humans moved through Devourer-controlled areas with confidence that bordered on arrogance, yet their casualty rate remained impossibly low. They seemed to understand their enemies better than coalition xenobiologists who had studied the species for years. Dr. Martinez established a field laboratory in the ruins of Settlement 7, where her research team began conducting experiments that made Zektar increasingly uncomfortable. She had captured several live Devourer specimens and was studying their responses to various stimuli with scientific detachment that seemed almost cruel. Communication systems are far more complex than previous analysis suggested, she reported, while observing a captive drone's reactions to different pheromone combinations. They possess individual identity markers within the hive structure, which creates opportunities for targeted psychological manipulation. Specialist Johnson assisted with the research by providing medical insight into Devourer physiology. Her analysis of enemy biology was thorough and precise, focusing on pain responses and vulnerability points with the methodical approach of someone planning systematic torture rather than conducting scientific study. Nervous system organization follows predictable patterns, Johnson explained while dissecting a deceased specimen. Pain receptors are concentrated in specific areas that can be targeted for maximum psychological impact. They also show strong stress responses to isolation from hive communication networks. Zektar watched these experiments with growing revulsion. Coalition military doctrine included provisions for intelligence gathering from captured enemies, but human methods went far beyond anything he had encountered in his military career. They were not simply seeking tactical information, but were learning to weaponize enemy psychology itself. The humans had begun using Devourer pheromones to create false breeding signals that caused internal conflicts within the hive structure. Different castes received contradictory instructions that led to territorial disputes and resource competition. What had once been a unified colony descended into chaos as various groups turned against each other based on manipulated communications. Private. Rodriguez demonstrated his growing fluency in Devourer chemical language by broadcasting messages that created genuine fear among enemy forces. He had learned to mimic distress calls from different castes, causing widespread panic whenever his transmissions reached hive networks. The psychological impact was devastating, as creatures that had never experienced terror suddenly found themselves paralyzed by unfamiliar emotions. "How did you learn to speak their language so effectively?" Zektar asked as he watched Rodriguez coordinate another false signal operation. Rodriguez looked up from his communication equipment with matter-of-fact expression. Same way humans learn any language, sir. You listen to patterns, identify meaning structures, then practice until you can reproduce the sounds accurately. Devourer chemical communication follows the same basic principles as any other linguistic system. The casual way Rodriguez described psychological warfare as a language exercise disturbed Zekatar more than any physical violence he had witnessed. The humans treated enemy manipulation as a technical skill rather than a moral compromise, approaching it with the same professional competence they applied to equipment maintenance or tactical planning. Sergeant Turner had developed what he called behavioral modeling that allowed him to predict devourer responses with frightening accuracy. He studied enemy movement patterns and social hierarchies until he could anticipate their actions hours in advance. This knowledge allowed his team to set traps and ambushes that eliminated targets with minimal risk to human forces. Hive species follow predictable behavioral algorithms, Turner explained while reviewing surveillance data. Once you understand their basic programming, you can manipulate situations to produce desired outcomes. They are actually much easier to control than individual species because they lack creative thinking capabilities. Corporal Williams had turned the entire settlement into a network of lethal surprises that responded to devourer movements with automated precision. Her traps used enemy biology against them, creating scenarios where their own natural behaviors became fatal weaknesses. Breeding instincts led them into kill zones while territorial responses triggered explosive devices. Most unsettling development was how quickly the humans adapted devourer technology for their own use. Dr. Martinez had identified ways to incorporate enemy biological systems into human equipment, creating hybrid tools that were more effective than either species could produce independently. Devourer sensory organs can be modified to enhance human perception capabilities, she reported, while demonstrating a device that used harvested enemy eyes to detect chemical signatures. Their communication glands can also be grafted onto human equipment to improve our pheromone manipulation systems. Zekatar felt sick watching humans modify their bodies with devourer parts as if they were upgrading mechanical equipment. The medical procedures showed no respect for the biological boundaries between species, treating enemy remains as raw materials for improvement projects. Captain Murphy called a tactical meeting in the abandoned settlement's community center where holographic displays showed the complete scope of devourer infiltration. The underground colony stretched across half the continent with breeding chambers that could produce thousands of new hostiles within days. Coalition doctrine called for immediate planetary evacuation followed by orbital sterilization. Standard procedures will not be sufficient, Murphy announced to the assembled team. The colony has reached critical mass and begun deep core excavation. Orbital bombardment will only drive them deeper underground where they can continue reproduction indefinitely. Dr. Martinez activated additional displays showing detailed biological analysis of the colony structure. However, we have identified systemic vulnerabilities that can be exploited using targeted biological warfare. The Hive communication network creates single points of failure that can cause colony-wide collapse. Zekatar studied the proposed attack plan with growing alarm. The humans intended to introduce modified pathogens into the devourer communication system that would cause neurological breakdown across the entire colony. The biological weapon would essentially drive every creature insane simultaneously, leading to colony self-destruction. This type of weapon has never been tested, Zekatar protested. The long-term effects could spread beyond the target colony and affect other devourer populations across the galaxy. Captain Murphy looked at him with the same calm expression he had worn during their first meeting. That would be an acceptable outcome, Commander. Total species elimination would end the war permanently and prevent future conflicts. The casual way Murphy discussed genocide as a tactical option made Zekatar realize he was witnessing something fundamentally different from normal military operations. The humans were not simply fighting a war, but were working toward complete extermination of their enemies using methods that violated every principle of honorable combat. Specialist Johnson began preparing the biological weapon with the same clinical efficiency she applied to treating wounded soldiers. Her medical knowledge allowed her to design pathogens that would cause maximum suffering while ensuring no possibility of recovery or adaptation. The weapon was crafted to destroy not just individual devourers, but their entire species. As Zektar watched the humans prepare for their final assault on the colony, he began to understand why they had been so eager to join the coalition war effort. They had not come to help defend against devourers, but to demonstrate their capabilities as apex predators. The war was simply an opportunity to prove that humanity belonged at the top of the galactic food chain. Deep beneath Xerion Prime's surface, the massive Devourer hive complex stretched through natural caverns and excavated tunnels like a living nightmare. Thermal scans revealed thousands of creatures moving through chambers the size of starship. Hangars while breeding pools bubbled with new life that would soon emerge to consume everything in its path. Coalition High Command had ordered complete planetary evacuation, followed by fusion bombing that would crack the world's crust and eliminate all life. Captain Murphy stood before the tactical display and calmly requested permission to attempt one final mission. His plan involved a small team penetrating the deepest levels of the hive complex to plant nuclear charges at structural weak points identified by Dr. Martinez's geological surveys. Success would collapse the entire network without destroying the planet's surface infrastructure. Request denied, Admiral Krexthul responded immediately. No force has ever successfully penetrated a mature devourer hive and returned. The risk to personnel is unacceptable when orbital bombardment can achieve the same result. Murphy studied the Admiral with the same analytical gaze he used when examining enemy positions. Orbital strikes will require 18 fusion warheads to guarantee complete sterilization. Those weapons could be used to defend 3 other worlds, currently under Devourer attack. Our mission would accomplish the same objective using only conventional explosives. Zektar found himself supporting the human plan despite every instinct warning him against it. Something about Murphy's confidence convinced him that these strange aliens might actually succeed where conventional forces would fail. Against direct orders from Coalition Command, he authorized the mission and volunteered to accompany the strike team personally. The descent into the hive began at midnight, when Devourer activity reached its lowest point. The human squad moved through the tunnel network like they belonged there, using captured pheromones to mask their scent while following routes mapped from interrogated prisoners. Their equipment included weapons built from Devourer technology that fired projectiles filled with modified neurotoxins. Dr. Martinez had accompanied the team with scientific equipment designed to study the hive's deepest levels. Her research objectives included capturing live specimens from the core breeding chambers where the most advanced devourer forms were developing. She moved through the tunnels with eager anticipation rather than fear, treating the mission as a research opportunity. Specialist Johnson carried medical equipment modified with devourer biological components that allowed her to monitor enemy vital signs through the tunnel walls. Her hybrid sensors could detect individual heartbeats and stress levels, providing real-time intelligence about creature locations and emotional states throughout the complex. Movement patterns suggest we are approaching a major intersection, Johnson reported while studying her readings. Multiple large forms detected approximately 50 meters ahead. Stress indicators show they are agitated but not yet aware of our presence. Sergeant Turner had painted his face with chemicals extracted from devourer corpses that disrupted their visual recognition systems. The camouflage was so effective that enemy patrols passed within arm's reach without detecting human presence. Turner moved like a ghost through their territory, marking targets for elimination with silent efficiency. The first major encounter occurred in a tunnel junction where 6 devourer warriors blocked the path to the deeper levels. Instead of engaging them directly, the humans deployed what they called conversion tactics, that turned the creatures against each other using manipulated pheromone signals and psychological pressure. Private Rodriguez broadcast carefully crafted messages that convinced each warrior that the others were planning territorial challenges. Within minutes, the group descended into savage combat as individuals fought for dominance using claws and mandibles designed to tear through armor plating. The humans passed through the carnage without firing a single shot. Impressive use of behavioral modification, Dr. Martinez commented while recording the encounter for future analysis. Social manipulation proves far more effective than direct confrontation when dealing with hierarchical species. We should document these techniques for coalition training programs. Corporal Williams had rigged the tunnel system with explosive charges that could be triggered remotely to prevent enemy reinforcements from following their route. Her bombs used devourer biological materials as accelerants, creating weapons that were specifically designed to cause maximum psychological trauma to any survivors who discovered the aftermath. The deeper they penetrated into the hive, the more disturbing the human methods became. They moved through breeding chambers filled with developing larvae and systematically poisoned the nutrient pools with compounds that would cause genetic mutations in the next generation. The biological warfare was designed not just to kill current populations, but to ensure that any survivors would be incapable of successful reproduction. Zektar watched Specialist Johnson inject captured specimens with experimental serums that caused rapid neurological breakdown. Her medical knowledge allowed her to inflict precise amounts of suffering while keeping subjects alive long enough for interrogation. The techniques she employed went far beyond anything taught in coalition military academies. Pain response indicates optimal stress levels for information extraction, Johnson reported while monitoring a captive drone's vital signs. Subject is ready for chemical interrogation using modified pheromone induction techniques. The interrogation methods developed by the humans combined Dr. Martinez's biological research with Rodriguez's communication expertise to create something that resembled advanced torture more than military intelligence gathering. They could force devourer subjects to experience emotions and sensations that their species had never evolved to handle. Captain Murphy demonstrated perfect understanding of hive psychology by targeting specific individuals whose removal would cause maximum disruption to colony organization. He had identified key communication nodes and breeding coordinators whose elimination would trigger systemic collapse throughout the entire complex. Hive species are vulnerable to strategic decapitation attacks, Murphy explained while marking priority targets on his tactical display. Remove the right individuals and the entire structure becomes dysfunctional. It is similar to destroying computer network servers to crash-connected systems. The approach to the Queen's Chamber required passing through the hive's most heavily defended areas where elite warrior castes protected the colony's reproductive center. The humans bypassed these defenses using tactics that violated every principle of honorable warfare, including the use of captured larvae as human shields and the deployment of chemical weapons in confined spaces. Dr. Martinez collected biological samples throughout their advance, gathering genetic material from different devourer castes for future weapons development. Her research equipment included tools for harvesting specific organs and tissues that could be used to create more effective biological warfare agents. When they finally reached the Queen's Chamber, Zektar found himself face to face with a creature the size of a coalition battleship. The Devourer Queen represented millions of years of evolution focused on consumption and reproduction. A living nightmare that had spawned countless offspring across dozens of worlds. She should have been the most terrifying thing he had ever encountered. Instead, he watched Captain Murphy approach the massive creature with the same calm confidence he had shown during their first meeting months ago. The human carried communication equipment loaded with pheromone samples that would allow him to speak directly to the colony's ruling intelligence. He intended to conduct a conversation with the Queen before detonating the nuclear charges. "Why? Do you wish to communicate with this creature?" Zektar asked, as Murphy prepared his equipment. Murphy looked up at the towering alien queen with eyes that showed no fear or hesitation. Because I want her to understand exactly what humanity represents before her species ceases to exist. She needs to know that we are not just another prey species, but something much more dangerous than anything her kind has encountered before. As Murphy began transmitting his message to the Queen, Zektar realized he was witnessing the moment when one apex predator announced its dominance to another. The human was not negotiating or threatening, but was simply explaining the new reality that her species would face for the brief remainder of its existence. 3 months after the Xerion Prime operation, Zektar stood in his new office aboard the Coalition flagship Eternal Vigilance and reviewed tactical reports that should have filled him with satisfaction. The war against the Devourers was finally turning in their favor after 18 months of devastating losses. Human military advisors had been assigned to every major coalition fleet, bringing with them the unconventional warfare techniques that were proving devastatingly effective against their ancient enemies. The transformation of coalition military doctrine had been swift and comprehensive. Species that had once prided themselves on honorable combat now employed human-inspired tactics that emphasized psychological warfare over direct confrontation. The Bruthari had learned to use captured enemy communications to create confusion within Devourer ranks. The elegant Zephyrians now deployed biological weapons that targeted specific genetic markers rather than relying on their traditional energy-based attacks. Zektar's promotion to senior human liaison came with access to classified reports that revealed the true scope of humanity's impact on the war effort. What had once been a systematic retreat across multiple star systems had become a coordinated extermination campaign that was driving Devourer forces back toward their home territories. The insects that had seemed unstoppable were now fleeing before coalition advances. Captain Murphy had been elevated to Strategic Warfare Advisor with authority to modify military operations across the entire theater. His recommendations were being implemented by species that had initially dismissed human capabilities as primitive and ineffective. The same aliens who had questioned what soft creatures could contribute to warfare now sought human approval for their battle plans. Dr. Martinez led a research division that studied captured Devourer specimens with scientific methodology that pushed far beyond traditional intelligence gathering. Her biological warfare programs had developed weapons specifically designed to exploit genetic weaknesses in enemy populations. The pathogens she created were so effective that entire Devourer colonies could be eliminated without firing a single shot. The efficiency of human warfare methods was undeniable, but Zektar found himself increasingly disturbed by what he observed in coalition forces that had adopted these techniques. Officers who had once been honorable warriors now spoke casually about genocide as a tactical option. The systematic extermination of enemy populations was discussed with the same clinical detachment used for routine supply requests. During a strategic planning session, General Thexkar presented projections that showed complete Devourer elimination within 2 years if current trends continued. The massive Bruthari officer who had once questioned human capabilities now advocated for total species destruction using methods that would have horrified his people only months earlier. Human tactical analysis indicates that partial victory will only lead to future conflicts, Thexkar explained, while displaying star charts showing Devourer retreat routes. Complete biological warfare deployment across their remaining territories will ensure permanent resolution of this threat. Zektar listened to these discussions with growing unease as he recognized how thoroughly human thinking had influenced coalition strategy. The focus had shifted from defending against Devourer attacks to actively hunting down and destroying every trace of their species throughout the galaxy. What had begun as a defensive war had become something approaching systematic murder. The psychological impact on coalition forces was becoming apparent in daily interactions throughout the fleet. Soldiers who had once treated captured enemies with basic dignity, now viewed prisoners as sources of biological material for weapons development. The torture techniques pioneered by human researchers were being refined and implemented by species that had never conceived of such methods. Specialist. Johnson had established medical research programs that used living devourer subjects to test new biological weapons and torture methods. Her work was considered essential to the war effort, but Zektar could not reconcile her clinical approach to inflicting suffering with his understanding of medical ethics. Pain response studies indicate optimal stress induction requires psychological manipulation combined with physical trauma, Johnson reported during a medical briefing that made several alien officers leave the room. Subject survival rates improve when fear conditioning is applied before direct interrogation begins. Private Rodriguez had trained coalition communication specialists to manipulate enemy psychology using techniques that went far beyond simple intelligence gathering. His students learned to create false memories and induce psychological breakdown in captured subjects with the efficiency of factory workers processing raw materials. The success of human methods was creating a feedback loop that encouraged even more extreme approaches to warfare. Each victory against devourer forces validated the effectiveness of psychological torture and biological warfare, leading to demands for escalation rather than restraint. Coalition forces were becoming more ruthless with each engagement. Zektar began to notice changes in his own thinking that disturbed him deeply. When reviewing battle reports, he found himself evaluating enemy casualties not in terms of military necessity, but in terms of efficiency metrics. He had started to think about warfare in the same analytical terms that humans used, viewing enemies as problems to be solved rather than opponents to be defeated. The realization that he was becoming like Captain Murphy terrified him more than any devourer attack ever had. The calm, analytical approach that made humans so effective at warfare was spreading to other species like a psychological infection. Coalition forces were losing their cultural identity and adopting human values that prioritized victory over honor. Dr. Martinez presented long-term strategic projections that extended far beyond the current conflict with devourers. Her research included detailed analysis of every coalition species with particular attention to potential vulnerabilities that could be exploited in future conflicts. The same systematic approach used against enemies was being applied to allies. Biological warfare capabilities developed during this conflict have applications beyond the current theater, Martinez explained during a classified briefing that only senior officers attended. The techniques we have refined could be adapted for use against any carbon-based life forms throughout the galaxy. Zektar realized that humans had never intended to simply join the coalition as equal partners. They had used the war against devourers as an opportunity to study and catalog every species in the galaxy while demonstrating their capabilities as apex predators. The systematic extermination of their enemies was less about winning a specific conflict and more about establishing dominance over all potential rivals. The final report he submitted to Coalition Command contained recommendations that he knew would never be implemented. His analysis concluded that human tactical methods, while effective, posed long-term threats to coalition stability and values. The psychological warfare techniques that made them so dangerous to enemies could easily be turned against current allies. As Zektar sealed his report and prepared for transmission, he received notification of another decisive victory against devourer forces. Human-trained coalition units had eliminated an entire colony using biological weapons that caused systematic breakdown of enemy nervous systems. The operation was being celebrated as a model of efficient warfare that other fleets should emulate. He looked out through his office viewing port at the stars beyond and wondered how many other species might be watching coalition fleet movements with the same analytical interest that humans had once focused on devourers. The galaxy had gained a powerful ally in the war against ancient enemies, but Zektar could not escape the feeling that they had also invited something far more dangerous into their midst. The humans had not just learned to fight monsters. They had become something that made monsters afraid to exist. And now they were teaching that same terrifying efficiency to everyone around them. The war would end soon, but Zektar feared that the real conflict was just beginning.